Hello, and welcome to the Did You Know Crypto podcast. Today, I'm very excited to be welcoming Pierre Rochard, who is one of the hosts of the Noted podcast, who is also part of the Nakamoto Institute, and is a Bitcoin maximalist and just all-around really knowledgeable person in this space. And he is going to be the second guest that I'm going to be having on for a series that's kind of outlining the scaling debate. This interview was very, very interesting. And I really enjoy talking to people that have different viewpoints than I do, and I hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. And really quick, if you could head over to iTunes or wherever you're listening to this episode on and leave a rating or review, I'd really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much for listening and enjoy the show. Today, I'd like to welcome Pierre Rochard, host of the Noted podcast, which everyone should subscribe to right now. He's also the co-founder of the Nakamoto Institute and an unstoppable proponent of Bitcoin, and I'm delighted to have him on the podcast. Pierre, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
And the purpose of this series is to lay out kind of multiple viewpoints from each side of the scaling debate so that, new people to this space kind of can listen to a semi-long form explanation of people's views, get different viewpoints from the same side of the debate, and kind of be able to understand more in depth why each individual has taken that position that they have. And I think, though, before we go into that, I think the most important question to kind of help establish a framework for understanding this is, what is Bitcoin and how do you define it?
So that's tough because Bitcoin actually ends up referring to several different things. So we have like the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network, and that's started out with one node, which was Satoshi's, and then Satoshi Nakamoto's node, and then you had Hal Finney's node, and from there it kind of multiplied into this big living organism called the Bitcoin network. So that's kind of like on the peer-to-peer level. And then you have the actual unit, like one Bitcoin is 100 million Satoshis. So that's like, and in the Bitcoin source code, those are called coins. They're not actually called Bitcoins. It would probably have been even more confusing if we'd started calling things coins, because people who are not into Bitcoin would be confused as to why we're not handing them a gold nickel or something like that. So yeah, that's kind of like the major dichotomy. But then you also, if you really like pull, split hairs, you've got the Bitcoin network, and you have the Bitcoin consensus, and you have the Bitcoin protocol. You have what people think the Bitcoin protocol should be versus like what's actually implemented. And you have the Bitcoin community, the Bitcoin culture, the Bitcoin ethos. There's just a lot of different things that the Bitcoin diet as well. It refers to a lot of different things, and it's a lot of different things to different people. So I like to say that like, you'll find in Bitcoin whatever you're looking for and whatever you're putting into it. So, and that's just based on my own observations of different people operating in this space, is that if they have a very negative attitude towards Bitcoin, then they kind of end up being on the receiving end of a lot of negativity from Bitcoiners, and vice versa. Like, I've seen people who have been very constructive and have helped build up Bitcoin, and they have been the recipients of a lot of positive energy from Bitcoiners and positive outcomes for whether it's their careers or their own work.
So that's kind of my feeling as well, is that it's kind of not so much just the technology, right, that people usually associate it with, but it's kind of grown a culture, I guess you could say a society in a way around it as well.
Yeah, and it's weird because it's like, well, we don't really have this for the US dollar. Like, there are people who work at the Federal Reserve and who worship the Federal Reserve, but You don't have this same kind of energy as you do around or with Bitcoin.
Yeah, there's not anybody spending hours a day on Twitter, other than maybe Nouriel Roubini defending the Fed. But uh, I wanted to kind of get into the scaling debate right away. So I was wondering if you could give a brief overview of the scaling debate as you saw it, as you participated in it.
Yeah. So I mean, when I first got interested in Bitcoin, what really caught my attention was Bitcoin's monetary policy of, building up to having only 21 million Bitcoins. And that is what I saw as its central value proposition, not really the like cheap instant payments. So already I think I was predisposed to having a certain view on the scaling debate. And when I first started using Bitcoin, I didn't really understand that there were different wallets available. And so I just downloaded like the Bitcoin wallet is what I thought I was downloading, which was the Bitcoin full node plus wallet. And I just downloaded that on my laptop and it synced, in a few days. And I didn't really think anything of it. I was like, okay, well, this is just like how it works. And yeah, from there, I remember reading. I mean, I obviously did a lot of research when I was first like going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole and reading about this 1 MB block size limit and thinking that was kind of a sensible, like it was advertised as being a denial of service prevention mechanism where like, okay, a miner can't just mine a massive block and cause all the other nodes to not be able to process it and to crash or whatever. So it made sense to me in that regard. And over time, as I learned more about how the Bitcoin system works, and I came to understand that the only way the 21 million Bitcoins is really a credible commitment is if we have the ability to essentially replace the block reward with transaction fees. And then the debate was kind of about, well, do you replace it by having a high number of low value transaction fees or a fewer number of high value transaction fees? And you could kind of contrast like for example, Lamborghini, they might have like a limited edition sports car, and that's how they maximize revenue versus Volkswagen, which mass produces cars, and that's how they maximize revenue. They don't try to be scarce that way. And so it's kind of two different ways of conceiving of a product and of its pricing strategy. And my background was in business, and I got my accounting major. So I'd taken like different marketing classes and whatnot. And so it made sense to me that if Bitcoin's value proposition is unique, then it doesn't actually really matter how high transaction fees are. People will be willing to pay them because the Bitcoin network itself has a monopoly over the sending of the underlying asset of Bitcoins. And so already I was kind of tilted in favor of having an approach where artificial scarcity of block space would cause transaction fees to be bid up and higher than they otherwise would be. And that would be the way to maximize total revenue because demand is inelastic or relatively inelastic. Now, granted, like I also I continue to have the view that eventually we will increase what's now the block weight limit, but we should do it based on demand outweighing supply rather than supply trying to stay ahead of demand. And the main argument against that is that so like if someone grants the yes, eventually we will have to phase out the block reward and have transaction fees become get higher, that we want to have the ecosystem slowly adapt to this reality rather than running into a hard limit. And the counter argument is like, well, we want to break expectations of cheap transactions on this network sooner rather than later, because it's only going to get worse as people build more and more businesses on top of this settlement layer. They're going to have the rug pulled out from under them when finally this issue comes to a head, and we can't kick the can down the road indefinitely. And so we kind of saw what the consequences of that were last year when we did hit the block weight limit, and people were really competing with each other to get into blocks. I think that the median fee got as high as $35 transaction for like the typical transaction. So clearly that proved out that the demand is indeed inelastic, and that a artificial scarcity of block space is a viable solution. Anyway, that was kind of my economic perspective. There's also an engineering perspective, which I think is important, and it's a combination of engineering and economics, which is that by increasing the cost of running a Bitcoin full node, you at the margin decrease the number of Bitcoin full nodes running and keeping up with the chain tip, and that's fine, within certain parameters. And I think it's fine today. Other people think that the block weight limit is too high today and that we need to soft fork it lower. I tend to disagree with that perspective, although I'm very sympathetic to it. I think that basically, if you can run a Bitcoin full node on a reasonably like $200 hardware setup, let's say, that seems to me a certain threshold where you have thousands of people running this and it makes it decentralized. And I think that's where we want to be at. And I talk about the hardware, but really the main issue is the bandwidth and access to bandwidth. I think that it's definitely improving. Like I just got Fios installed, so I've got gigabit internet, whatever. And it's fast, but I realize I'm on the kind of cutting edge there, and it's kind of a part of living in New York is that you might get access to this sooner than other parts of the country or of the world, especially. But as Fios and as wireless internet continue to increase, and high bandwidth wireless internet, especially. That's going to change, and eventually the economics of running a full node will continue to improve, and eventually we'll have enough breathing space where, okay, it makes sense from a decentralization perspective to increase the block weight limit at the margin and to increase Bitcoin's on-chain capacity. So yeah, I've kind of been rambling. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's great. I was actually I wanted to mention we talked on Twitter a little bit about how you said you were actually in favor of bigger blocks. I think you kind of explained that a little bit. But did you mean in the sense of eventually, or did you mean that you were actually in favor of a block size increase last fall?
Oh, eventually. I was very strongly opposed to the increase last fall of.
No, that's what I thought. Yeah, so I just wanted to make sure.
It's kind of challenging because basically I was opposed to the capacity increase that we got from SegWit, and I was opposed to the so-called 2x hard fork, which would have doubled the block weight limit from 4 million weight units to 8 million weight units. And that was a hard fork. But I was also opposed to the SegWit capacity increase, but I kind of capitulated on that rather quickly because I realized that there was no way I was going to get people to agree with me. And so, yeah, but eventually we'll want to do a hard fork to increase the block weight limit as well. But that's just not in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, that was something I remember listening to Jameson Lopp as well, was that, once Lightning is, fully on board, I mean, eventually after all the different kinds of aggregators have been implemented, there will be a need for it at some time. But Giacomo actually disagreed that would ever be needed, or was skeptical of it.
Yeah, I'll agree to disagree with Giacomo on that. Unless there's like some really out there innovative engineering breakthrough that happens, I think that we'll eventually have a hard fork for a capacity increase.
Just as a thought experiment, I mean, what would be kind of a ballpark fee limit where you think that, I mean, roughly speak, I mean, I know that it would be kind of driven by the network and driven by, a demand and everything, but what would be a rough ballpark where you kind of go like, yeah, I think probably about X would be where we probably should start maybe considering it.
Well, I mean, it's tough because I don't think that is the metric that we can target. I think
Okay.
that metric is actually an outcome of what we do target. And so I think that um, targeting having a mempool that is always has a consistent backlog um, is important. And so they're already like the mempool. It occasionally spikes, but broadly speaking, it's been empty since the big run up in December of 2017. So I would really want to see a mempool that is backed up for at least 18 months, uh, and then kind of look holistically both. Yeah, at what is the kind of the dollar price of sending the typical on-chain transaction, but also how is that impacting the Lightning Network and the opening and closing of channels, and how is bandwidth, how is internet service rollout happening globally? How has that evolved since the last time we took a look at it? And kind of looking at the bigger picture rather than trying to target a specific fee itself.
Okay. I wanted to ask, I mean, part of this was I wanted to kind of put to, the people on both sides of the debate, kind of some of the arguments, or I guess in a way that the other side argues for. So, I mean, one of them I wanted to ask was that there's a big uh, focus with big block folks on, the Satoshi's vision, that, whatever you want to call that, right? So, what influence should the white paper and his writings have on Bitcoin now? Is that, relevant per se, or is it more of a, he left the project, and now it's, everybody else is the network. It's all the new developers. It's, our quote unquote
Yeah,
network now.
right. Well, both. I mean, it's definitely relevant because he, he put this system together and it functions rather well. Um, and on the flip side is that yeah, he did leave, and we've learned a lot about the system since he's left. And I would go so far as to argue that we know more about Bitcoin today than Satoshi did when he left. And I bet you Satoshi would agree with that if he were still around. Like, I don't think that he had the hubris to think he's omniscient or omnipotent. And look, like something as so then also, I think that people paid too much attention to the white paper and not enough attention to the code and to how the network actually behaved and continues to behave to this day. But if you look in the code, like Satoshi had this vision of doing off-chain micropayments like Lightning, using a feature called end sequence. But it turned out that like his implementation didn't work very well, and so the Lightning Network is like an iteration on that. So, like to say that Lightning is not part of Satoshi's vision, I find to be absurd because clearly it was. It was right there in the code base, and he talked about micropayments, and so I don't think that I think that some of the criticism is like gets kind of ideological and political rather than based on the actual facts. Um, and yeah, and then I think that the other part of the vision that is disputable is Satoshi was saying that basically we would have only miners running full nodes in data centers, and there's no reason for anyone who is not a miner to be running a full node. And I think that he just didn't foresee how easy it is to separate the functionality of mining from running a full node. In that today, most miners are just providing hash rate and are not running a full node. It's the pool operator that is running a Bitcoin full node. So all this to say that like Satoshi didn't exactly look into the future and see ASICs and the mining pools and the current structure of the industry and say, oh, this is my vision. Like that's not his vision. Was more like one CPU, one vote. And I don't think he was thinking, several chess piece moves ahead there, which means that essentially miners have evolved into an entity that absolutely needed to have its power checked, because if miners were indeed the only people running full nodes, they could create more Bitcoins for themselves. And the only disincentive for doing that is that would reduce the value of Bitcoin because of the inflation. But that's kind of irrelevant to a miner because they're the first beneficiaries of the seigniorage. And so the cost is actually very dispersed among Bitcoin holders, and the benefit is very concentrated on the Bitcoin miners. And so just that alone, makes it clear to me that we can't trust the miners to do full validation. And in fact, like we have historical cases of miners, even with a pool operator, like where they were doing headers first mining, which is basically like it's quote unquote SPV mining, where they're not doing full validation and they were mining invalid blocks. And so the idea that like, oh, non-mining nodes don't matter. All right, but mining non-nodes matter. Like there's kind of a weird asymmetry there. And it's clear that you do need to have non-mining nodes providing a check on miners.
Yeah, I was wondering if we could expound on that a little bit, just especially for people that are a little bit newer, because the so-called economic node or whatever you want to call it that you or I would run is something that not all, but quite a few, especially a lot of the vocal people on the big block side, say aren't really that important. If it's that worth it to you, you can run it. And if it becomes too expensive, right, because blocks are too big, then it's obviously not important to you. But what is the coming from the the off-chain scaling side and keeping the small block side, or keeping the block small? Why is that such a kind of a force multiplier per se to the network to have these economic nodes be economically viable for the average person?
Yeah, so I kind of see it as like an issue of how many nodes do you need to be able to self-determine as a whole, which is kind of this is the tricky part of consensus, the consensus rules, because basically, so the economic nodes, the way that's kind of used is like it's usually used to like refer to like large exchanges that are using their full node to verify payments that they're receiving, and in my mind, like there's no distinction between an exchange that is doing that on the behalf of a million users and a million different users doing that on their own behalf by running their own node. The difference is that in one, they are the users are delegating all of that to the exchange, and the other they're not. So my view is that we should prefer the latter, because the former becomes vulnerable to a number of different issues whether it's government intervention or just the exchange screwing over customers by sending them fake Bitcoins, or the issue of the exchange not having the right incentives aligned, where essentially they're doing hard forks or participating in hard forks that are not to the benefit of the users, and the users have no ability to claim their coins on the other side of the fork. So there's a number of different kinds of scenarios, and like you can't do your own hard fork without running your own full node, and you can do your own hard fork without mining. And I think that this is something that goes unsaid a little too often, which is that people think that, if you're not mining, then you have no ability to impact the consensus rules, because ultimately the consensus rules for transactions go into blocks, and those blocks have to be mined by a miner. And what they're missing in that kind of flow chart is that valid transactions accumulate in the mempool and have a transaction fee on them that at some point gets so high that it incentivizes miners to go in and mine, whether they care about the fork or not. They're just doing it in a self-interested manner in order to profit. And so you can have a hard fork that starts with 0 miners and has transactions accumulate in the mempool until a miner eventually defects and decides that they're going to collect these transaction fees for themselves by mining blocks on this fork. So having a full node allows you to bootstrap a consensus change, whereas just having hash rate is really completely useless. Like at the very least, you've got to have a full node pool operator that is going to help you bootstrap. But really, you should just run a full node.
Next, I want to kind of talk about Lightning Network, because obviously with wanting to keep the block size small, you have to scale off chain, right? So, I mean, blockchain or Lightning is still not really viable yet. I mean, it's admittedly by the folks working on it that it's not ready for consumer use or adoption, right? But just looking at it, the way that I just have, and I'm not a developer at all, so it's harder for me because I can't look at the nuts and bolts, right? But looking at it from the perspective also of the non-first world countries, right? So you and I wouldn't have that big of an issue, and even somebody on the lower end of the spectrum in the Western world probably be able to do this. But when you start talking about third world countries, things like running your own nodes, being able to have funds to be able to open up channels, that sort of thing, I have a hard time seeing where that's going to be an option until the eventual raising of the third world into the first world status. What are your thoughts on how can Lightning Network or other solutions, but with keeping the block small, still offer possibilities? Or is this going to be something that we just kind of cede to things like M-Pesa, or I don't know how to pronounce that, but the credit or the cell phone company over there that trades basically credits to SMS? Are we going to basically kind of cede that for the moment until we can get other solutions online, or how do you see that working out?
Yeah, so I think that the Lightning Network is definitely on mainnet. I mean, it's live now, and it's rapidly evolving, and it's going to rapidly evolve into a direction where essentially a consumer will be able to send a payment to a merchant in a trustless manner using Lightning, and essentially paying a negligible amount of fees. Like, you wouldn't even really notice the fees that you're paying; they're so small. And the payment would get sent instantly. And so I think that that's where Lightning is evolving towards, and it's just a matter of time before that's widely deployed and usable in any country with bandwidth issues. So I'm very optimistic in that regard. I think that there are definite downsides to Lightning, and I don't think that transaction fees or routing fees, as they're called in Lightning, would be a downside. I think that that's going to be very affordable. Um, Now, in terms of how, like, I don't know how in demand Bitcoin is going to be around the world. I think people have a lot of theories about it, but in practice, it seems to diverge from the theories a lot. Um, and so, like, just to illustrate, when I first started getting interested in Bitcoin in early 2013, there was the Cyprus bail-in. I don't know if you remember
Oh
that.
yeah, yep.
Where basically like the banks were seizing like 15% of deposits or something. And this was because they needed that money to like pay off or to keep the bank solvent. Um, and everyone in Bitcoin was like, oh, look, we're going to have everyone in Cyprus using Bitcoin because they just went through this terrible experience where their lack of financial sovereignty made them lose money. And you had like rumors going around on Reddit, like, oh, Bitcoin is the official currency of Cyprus now, like all sorts of things where people thought that there was mass adoption happening in Cyprus, but there wasn't. Like it was all fake news. So I think that you kind of see this happen in news cycles where people, and they've also said this like about China, like, oh, everyone's using Bitcoin to route around capital controls in China, and then you look at it and it's like, no, they're not. They're like using antique furniture to do it. uh, there's always like hype about different use cases, and there isn't like as serious work into figuring out, all right, what are use cases that people are actually using Bitcoin for, or actually using the broader ecosystem of crypto for. I think people like don't think very rigorously about that because they know that 99.99% of it is just speculation on exchanges. And so it's kind of irrelevant how many transactions per second your blockchain can do if most of most of the economic activity happens on trusted layer 2, which is exchanges, which I would contrast with trustless layer 2 like Lightning. Um, so yeah, I think that even if Lightning were to fail and people have to use exchanges in order to send money to each other, I don't think that's the end of the world either. Like it's less than it's a missed opportunity because there's no reason why a system like Lightning can't work. But it's not the end of the world for Bitcoin either.
I guess talking with yourself and Giacomo, I guess it's kind of more of a people need to be more patient, focus on the kind of big picture, the macro, more than on the immediate micro.
Well, yeah, but I don't know about being more patient. Like I'm very impatient, but I also I'm looking at what's immediately in front of us, right? Like you hear people say like, oh, how are we going to onboard the next billion people onto Bitcoin? It's like, can we just focus on onboarding one person at a time? Like, to me, it seems more like I'm impatient about onboarding the next user. Like that's what I'm impatient about. Onboarding the next billion users to me seems like kind of just you're onboarding zero users by doing that because you're not doing anything useful.
Yeah, I guess that kind of rolls into this kind of last question that I had for you, and I'd asked Giacomo it as well, and I wanted to hear your perspective on it. But kind of like my observation of humanity is that kind of people are inherently, I guess, lazy, at least in the Western societies, for a variety of reasons. Or I should say that people are more attracted to solutions that have the least amount of friction, kind of on the x-axis and kind of closest to their normal on the y-axis. If you can create a solution for a problem that's easier than what they're currently using and as close as possible to what they're already comfortable with, that's kind of usually what wins. And, one of my concerns is that, you know, this is because we're such a young space, but 95% of the products and, you know, anything that we kind of have in this space is pretty clunky. It's hard to figure out. I think it's a lot to do with the fact that it's very developer focused, which a lot of the engineers in any kind of discipline I've ever met, they're very detail oriented, they're very intelligent, but they're not the best, generally speaking, with kind of understanding consumer trends and demands, I guess, and aesthetics. And, you know, like Uber exploded because, you know, it saved us time. It was easy to figure out. You pushed a button, you sit on your couch. You didn't have to go and flag anything down. You didn't have to call up a cab company, and you just sat on your couch till it said it was there. You went down and you got in, right? And, you know, same thing with email. Email eventually beat out snail mail because it was easy and it became familiar. And with the store of value thesis, and if Lightning is supposed to be kind of, you know, roughly my daily spender, you know, what I buy my the proverbial cup of coffee with, how well do you think it's going to compete, you know, with something like MasterCard has been talking about doing their own, you know, blockchain, you know, token, whatever they're talking about doing. And when all you have to do is go online, sign up for one of the cards, pay your bill, it's done, versus, say, you know, setting up your own full node, transferring Bitcoin to the network, opening up a channel, all that kind of stuff, watchtowers. And I guess it just sounds like a lot of work for the average person to implement compared to spending, you know, 2 minutes on a MasterCard website. And people want that easier, familiar solution. And I believe that Bitcoin is going to win definitely in the long run. I think it's better. I think it's sound money. And that's, you know, a mixture of economics and, I guess, faith, I guess, in a way as well. But but gold was sound money. It was better than fiat. And for the last 60 years, other than, you know, small groups of libertarians like ourselves and, you know, some probably right-wing preppers, no one really embraced it as a store of value outside of, you know, some sort of ETF maybe in a balanced portfolio. So sorry for kind of going on long, but why do you think, given that with gold's failure to kind of, you know, win out as that true store of value or as that people would hold their money versus in an IRA, why do you think Bitcoin and Lightning Network are going to win where gold or other measures couldn't?
Yeah, so I think that the problem with gold is that it was not hard enough, essentially. And if you kind of think about like Bitcoin's difficulty adjustment, it occurs every 2 weeks to readjust the balance between the hash rate and the, you know, coins getting created, blocks getting created. Gold doesn't really have a difficulty adjustment, or its difficulty adjustment is much looser than Bitcoin's. And so when you get into a situation where gold is appreciating in value versus another money, it starts getting more resources dedicated to mining it, and more gold gets produced. And then it has a dampening effect on the dynamic of a sound money accruing value versus fiat. And we kind of saw that during the 70s, right? Like there was a window of opportunity where gold was competing against the dollar and could have caused the dollar to collapse if it had continued along its route, its trajectory. But on the dollar side, you had Paul Volcker come in and dramatically increase interest rates. Like today, interest rates are like 0%. Paul Volcker increased them to 20% in the late 70s, early 80s. And so that reestablished the credibility of the U.S. dollar's monetary policy after it had gotten trashed by the inflation during the 70s. So that's kind of on the dollar side. And on the gold side, like more and more gold was coming onto the market, and there's not like it doesn't have the soundness that Bitcoin has. So I think that just at the very least, Bitcoin would cause fiat currencies to have to dramatically improve their monetary policy, much as gold has. Now, Bitcoin has other advantages over gold, whether it's, you know, from a cryptographic primitives perspective of like you can't do multi-sig with gold. Moving $1 billion worth of gold is much more expensive than moving $100 million worth of gold, or 10 million, or 1 million, and so on. So in terms of moving value, you have to pay as a percentage of the value. Whereas with Bitcoin, you pay based on how much data you're consuming on the network. And so you could be moving $1 billion worth of Bitcoin, and it could be consuming as much data as moving $20 worth of Bitcoin. And so that dramatically lowers the cost of making high value settlement transactions, which I think that ultimately, like that helped in hampering gold from becoming a real competitor versus the dollar, right? Because the dollar became digitized in the 20th century. I guess probably like the banking system, along with the banking system in the 60s and 70s. And so the dollar was decreasing its transaction costs, whereas gold was not decreasing its transaction costs, right? It's always going to cost the same amount to ship it and to secure it and store it. So it was very hard for gold to compete, whether it's on monetary policy or on the underlying payment system that it provides. I think that Bitcoin stands a much better chance at competing on both fronts, whether it's payments or monetary policy. I think that the contrast with an app like Uber is that you don't have the like holding and investing side of things and the speculation side of things. And that's where it gets really messy, in that human psychology is just not designed for dealing with massive wild swings in value. It causes us to emotionally go from like mania to depression. So I think that when Uber was increasing in popularity, the people who were shareholders in Uber went through an emotional roller coaster of having their investment dramatically increase in value, but the users of Uber did not, and so it did not affect how they used Uber that Uber was being very successful. That's not the case in Bitcoin at all. The users are people who hold Bitcoins and who are using the Bitcoin network to transfer value, and as the value of Bitcoins dramatically swings, it dramatically affects the users of the underlying system, and either attracts new users or causes existing users to churn and to no longer be interested in it because they were attracted by the price, right? So it's I think that the Bitcoin price is a big driver in its adoption, and in fact, like the premier driver of adoption, not any other aspect of the payment system or even of the monetary policy, because the price is essentially downstream from the monetary policy, and it's what people see on CNBC. Like CNBC doesn't talk about, oh, Bitcoin has sound money, blah blah. Like CNBC talks about how Bitcoin went up 30% or 50% or 100%. Like that's what gets eyeballs and gets people interested in it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Like I got interested in it because of the price as well. And it's good. It's a good way to bait people into this giant multi-level marketing Ponzi scheme where you have to learn about economics and cryptography and computer science.
Yeah, no, that's, I think you said, was it about 2013 is when you?
Yeah. And so I would not expect Bitcoin to become mainstream until it actually causes the US dollar to collapse, and then people don't really have any other choice. I don't think that it's going to be like driven by anything else.
Well, I know that you got to get going, and I really appreciate your time. Was there any closing thoughts that you had?
Yeah, sure. So go to noted.org, NODED.org to subscribe to our podcast, and follow me on Twitter at Pierre_Rochard, and also follow my co-host Michael Goldstein at Bitstein, and follow the Nakamoto Institute on Twitter as well. Michael has been updating the Nakamoto Institute to have more and more content and also better user interface, so you can check out everything that Satoshi wrote, as well as with a bunch of other authors. So those would be my shout outs. And yeah, thanks for having me on. This was a fun interview.
Well, thanks again. I'll put all of the contact information, everything you mentioned in the show notes. And once again, Pierre, thank you very much.
Awesome. Bye.